What's up, sons? It's Blind Run with Son of a Tech once again, and today I am here to talk to you guys about this little project back here, which I have so lovingly named or tagged Project Terminator, and I had to use the Project Terminator PC hashtag because Project Terminator was already taken. This is the Terminator. It's made up of an old Dell Precision T5500 workstation with a Xeon X5675 6-core processor clocked at 3.4 GHz when turboed. It has 40 gigabytes of ECC DDR3 and 2 GTX 770s with a whopping 5 solid-state drives in RAID 0. It's no slouch when it comes to gaming. So this project pretty much started because I had an old CPU, not even that old, from an old server that I was like, what can I do with this? It's an X5675. I can't just trash it. It's got to be useful for something like gaming, right? It's one of the higher clocked Xeons from its generation, and it's a total of 6 cores and 12 threads, which is a lot. So I had that sitting there, and I had a whole bunch of extra RAM sitting around because I've had a couple 710s, PowerEdge 710s go through my office here and there, and I just needed to do something with that as well. Now, I didn't really have an X58 board, which is what this CPU would go into. This socket was a 1366, and I went around to go try to find one, and all of the X58 boards were crazy expensive used on eBay or broken. They would say it might boot, it might not. So I had to figure out a different way to get this working, and after some research I figured out that a Dell Precision T5500 had the same socket, and it was a single socket workstation. So I did some looking around, and I found a couple on eBay, but shipping costs were going to get me kind of in trouble, so I went ahead and hit up Craigslist once again. So I found a guy that is in IT as well. If you guys didn't know, I'm in IT as well too. But he works for a different company, and he likes to buy lots. So he will buy lots of old workstations, and then he'll basically sell them, part them out, and so on and so forth. And he had some Dell T3500s. So I went down, and I knew that I had the RAM, and I knew that I had the processor, and then I also knew I had the GTX 770. So I had everything that I kind of wanted in my head. And I went to take a look at the Dell T3500, and there were a couple problems. First, the power supply was only about a 500 watt power supply, which I knew probably wasn't going to cut it, seeing that I had 2 GTX 770s I wanted to throw in there. And my original goal was to go ahead and use the power supply that was in the Dell as well for the build to save me some cost. The second problem was that the Dell T3500 actually didn't seem or appear to have enough room in the case to fit 2 GTX 770s. Even after stripping it all the way down, I wasn't sure. So he offered a Dell T5500 for $100, and it had a little 1.6 gigahertz Xeon in there, and I was just going to trash that. And I let him take all the RAM out and the drives and went on my way. The drives I bought from the same guy, actually. So the drives weren't originally part of the plan. I had a Kingston 248 gigabyte SSD that I was planning on putting in there. But while I was there, he pointed out that he had some solid state drives. These are Kingston V100s. And so they're a little bit older, and they have a stock standard read speed of like 200 megabytes per second and a write speed of about 128 gigabytes per second. and he was selling them for $20 a piece. So I was like, well, how many SATA slots does this motherboard have? It has 5. Give me 5 of those. So I picked up 5 solid state drives, and they were all the Kingston 128 gigabyte V100s. So I got home all happy and we were putting it all together, and unfortunately I ran into a problem, and I thought I was going to be able to resolve it. I knew that it was going to be an issue, but I thought I could do some adapters or something like that, and that was the problem of power. Once I kind of got everything stripped down, and we ran all of the SATA cables behind the motherboard and ran all the power cables everywhere that we needed to be, I mounted the GPUs up and started to try to figure out how I was going to get 2 more 8 pins in there. The power supply that came with it had 2 6 pins, which honestly would have been a pretty cool build to stick with in the first place, but I just had to push it further. So I had to figure out how to get the power there, and after looking up for adapters, the power supply in the Dell did have a second CPU power because it's a dual socket motherboard, and there was a converter that I could use for that to get the 8 pin, and then there was another converter that I could use basically essentially to get power off of the SATA to 8 pin, and there's 2 problems with that. One, you are not positive those adapters are always going to work. They're not very reliable. And 2, the cost of the adapters was the same as just running down to Best Buy and picking up the Corsair CX750M for about $80. So that's the option I went ahead and went with. Once we got the power supply in there and everything powered up, it was time to hop into the BIOS settings and the configuration settings. So if you guys don't know, these workstations kind of have the similar setup as a server. So you'll have your configuration menu and you will have your UEFI separately. There is a legacy UEFI that you can get, but I didn't choose to go with that. And the first thing I did was to configure the storage. So we configured the storage into a RAID 0 with 5 solid state drives. Once we did that, we went ahead and hopped into the BIOS and we turned off any of the C states because we're going to be using this for gaming, and C states on the Xeon just isn't going to always be reliable because it's not going to ramp up as quickly into the turbo. So I just wanted to lock the processor at its turbo boost clock and call it a day, which luckily the BIOS allows from Dell. We went ahead and threw a copy of Windows 10 on there, Windows 10 Pro, and got it booted up. And then we started grabbing drivers. The first big problem with the drivers was that we didn't have any SLI support on this Dell motherboard. While the wikis and Wikipedia said that this motherboard and the Dell T5500 had SLI support, it was incorrect, and the Dell actually only supports Crossfire, so there's a win for AMD there. So I had to find a way to work around this because I was not about to pull out and run. That's what she said. I was not about to pull out a 770 and run a single 770. That's not how this build was going to go. This was Project Motherfucking Terminator. So after some research, I found a solution. It's a patcher called Different SLI. And what Different SLI allows you to do is run SLI configurations on motherboards that don't support SLI natively. It also allows you to run it without an SLI bridge. This actually took some work because Different SLI doesn't currently have a patcher that functions with the latest NVIDIA drivers. So we had to go with a legacy driver, and the latest one we could get to work and function with Different SLI was 365.1. So once we got that loaded up and got it patched, we were now up and running with 770s in SLI. So fantastic. What are the numbers? Let's talk about them. So hopping straight into the benchmark, my favorite one is what I'm going to talk about first. The RAID configuration that we were able to get in RAID 0 with 5 V100s. Keep in mind that original read and write speed that I talked about earlier. Running a crystal disk benchmark, we found that now in 5 of these in RAID 0, it has a read speed of 649 megabytes per second with a write speed of 523, which is awesome. That's a huge improvement over what we had before. Next, we'll talk about our Cinebench score. This is what you guys are probably curious about because there are these builds coming around with Xeons lately, and people are curious if they can build gaming rigs off of these old Xeons, because the area where people seem to trash and get rid of most is in enterprise. So a lot of these old servers get decommissioned before the life of the CPU is even close to being done. That's the case in this X5675, and the Cinebench score came out to a whopping 748. Now, mind you, it reads as a clock of 3 gigahertz, but we know from our CPU-Z that we were running at 3.3 megahertz after the boost clock. Actually, even a little above that, getting closer and closer to that 3.4. That 748, to keep that in mind for gaming, would put you right around the i7-3770K. And it beats out any 3rd gen or below consumer grade i7. But here's the caveat to that. Unfortunately, the i7-3770K does still outperform the Xeon in single-threaded performance, and not by a little bit, by quite a lot, about 1,000 points. And you can see this with the Firestrike benchmark in our combined score, where we only received a 4,500. You can also see it in the TimeSpy score that we took, where our CPU score was 3,873. What about games, you say? Games. That's what matters. We were building a gaming rig. Well, I got the benchmarks here and we're going to talk about them. Let's start with the worst one that we had experience with, and that's going to be Assassin's Creed Syndicate. This is the newest Assassin's Creed, and not a lot of people are playing it, but I find it good for benchmarking DirectX 11 games because it is so demanding. Now, the problem with the system that we have currently is that the SLI profile that we had enabled was not taking effect in Assassin's Creed Syndicate, and the GPU is only, unfortunately, running 2 gigabytes of video memory. So that limited us a lot, and we could only get Syndicate to run at low settings, and we only received about a 52.4 frames per second. Things didn't look much better for Doom either. We ran the test in Doom OpenGL 4.5, and I know most of my tests now are going to be Vulkan and so on and so forth, but that's for new hardware, and we wanted to really just see what we are getting for our dollar on this. So Doom in the OpenGL with ultra settings still performed admirably at 51 frames per second, running on a single GTX 770, as it still doesn't have SLI support at the time of making this video. Things got better though, they really did, and we can start to see that with Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 has SLI support, and we can max out the settings and run at a buttery smooth 58.8 average frames per second. And in my testing, I couldn't even really notice it going down to that. For the most part, I saw a pretty solid 60 frames per second, and that's maxed out. Now, I do realize that Dark Souls 3 caps at 60 frames per second, but we're trying to play the latest and greatest games on this conversion, and the Terminator is able to handle it. Things only got better from there. We popped in The Witcher 3 with the SLI support, and we're able to play on high settings with no hairworks at a super smooth 69.2 frames per second. And that is an NVIDIA supported game, but I gotta say, for cards that old and running on a Xeon, I was super happy because that's one of my favorite games to play, and it's a very demanding game as well. Going even further into some more titles, we have a game that scales very, very well, Far Cry Primal, with SLI support, and we turned on the HD textures and turned on to high settings. Now, we didn't max out the settings, we did go to high settings, and in our benchmark, we were able to get 73.3 frames per second. Now, I will mention that if you do go up to max settings on HD textures, you have some pretty hefty frame drops that make the game not very fun. I wouldn't say not playable. I would just say, like, between the frame drops and then the pop-in, because of the limitation on VRAM, it was better to play at high settings. Finally, we have Grand Theft Auto 5, which scales super well in SLI, and on normal settings, we were able to go ahead and start pushing my 144Hz ASUS panel, and we were able to push out a buttery smooth and super fast 134 frames per second. So if you guys are looking at building something for a GTA 5 rig, you might want to look into some older tech and older hardware with maybe an SLI option, seeing as I was able to pick up the 770s off Craigslist for $100 for the pair. I'm pretty happy with the performance. Finally, we have Tomb Raider, and Tomb Raider came out to an average of 57.9 frames per second maxed out in 1080p. All of these tests were in 1080p and as high a settings as I could get to where I felt the games were playable. In conclusion, if you're willing to work for it and you know where to look and how to solve problems with old hardware, building something from an old workstation might be the way you want to go, especially if you're on a tight budget. I hope you guys enjoyed the Terminator. I love the Terminator. And I hope you guys will stick around the channel and like and comment and subscribe. I think this Terminator is going to be headed to somebody's house soon. I haven't decided when or how, but I don't have a use for it. And it was a project that I wanted to build. And I've been super happy with the channel and all the support you guys have given. And we will be talking about a giveaway. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And let me know what you guys think about the build in the comment section below. And I'll see you next Tuesday.